Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to Child Labour and Education in Megacity Slums. As you can see, I'm Larry Elliott. I'm the economics editor of The Guardian. And as well as all of you here in London, we've got online viewers, people who are watching around the world, and you can ask questions, and we'll ask those for you. They'll pop up on my iPad, and if people want to follow us on Twitter, you can at ODI Dev hashtag Stop Child Labour. This is a big and important topic. Child labour seems to have fallen down the agenda of international issues that need to be addressed, even though it is acknowledged as one of the Sustainable Development Goals. Millions of children are being kept out of school and are working as child labourers, and this has a important dimension when it comes to poverty and tackling child poverty. So what we want to explore tonight is, do we understand the scale of the problem? What are the implications of child labour? What can we do about it? And so this meeting really is to launch the findings of a major survey on child labour and education in Dhaka in Bangladesh. And this we'll look and explore what it's going to take children out of the workplace and into school. And I'd like to welcome our panel, an expert panel with me. Let's start on my right. That's Kevin Watkins, who's the Chief Executive of Save the Children UK. On my left is Maria Quattri, who's Research Fellow at ODI. On her left is Phil Bloomer, Executive Director, Business and Human Rights Resource Centre, formerly of Oxfam, as was Kevin. And by video link, welcome, is Mushtaq Chowdhury, who's the Vice Chairperson and Advisor to BRAC in Bangladesh, which is a development organisation based in Dhaka. Can you see us? Can you see us, Mushtaq? Good.
Yes.
Good. Excellent.
Yes,
okay.
I do actually.
Okay.
Yeah,
Good.
wonderful.
Welcome, and we'll come back to you in a minute, because I want to start really by asking Maria and Kevin to introduce this report which they co-authored for the ODI. Which of you two wants to start the proceedings off?
So I was going to kick off very briefly. So the first thing to say, the bulk of the report is setting out the findings from a survey in Dhaka, which Maria led on. So the bulk of the acclaim for the report has to go to Maria. And obviously 100% of the things you don't agree with in the report are entirely Maria's responsibility and absolutely nothing to do with me at all. So, but actually, Larry, just to set the context a little bit, that I think it's very striking when you look at debates on child labour, because these are debates with a very contemporary relevance. So, we now have a Sustainable Development Goal for the elimination of child labour, which has been signed up to by governments around the world, none of whom have the faintest intention of actually implementing what's in the Sustainable Development Goals. But what's very striking is, if you look at contemporary debates, is their historical resonance. And we actually start the report by referring back to a commission, a parliamentary commission on child labour that took place in 1832. There's an interview with a parent and an interview with a child. And they're actually straight, heartbreaking stories of, a parent talking about the whip of necessity that gives them no choice but to let their 10-year-old, 11-year-old kid go and work in a textile factory for 60 hours a week. And then a child who reports, having to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to walk 2 miles to go and earn enough money to put bread on the table. And actually there's an extraordinary resonance with these debates. This is from 1832. And the contemporary debate around child labour really starts from the framing of international labour organisation conventions, of which there are two primary conventions, Convention 138 and 182, which I'm not going to go into in detail. But essentially they differentiate between three different types of work. So one of them is work which is compliant with the convention, which is children shouldn't be entering labour markets aged below 14, in the case of least developed countries and low-income countries. They shouldn't be working for more than 14 or 15 hours a week. They're allowed to participate in light work. And then there's a separate categorisation of hazardous industries where kids shouldn't be working. So There's a differentiation between work, labour, and hazardous work. And then there's another, the 182 Convention is on modern slavery and the most extreme forms of child labour. And the international data is essentially that there are 165 million children involved in child labour, around half of them in hazardous labour. And actually, and a lot of those are under the age of 15. So this is primary school age kids who are involved in the worst types of child labour. And I think it's a safe and secure bet. The reason a lot of these kids are out of school is because they're working, although the causality works in both directions. And so we wanted to explore the relationship between child labour and education in the context of one city in one country. So the country is Bangladesh. And I think it's a good case study because on almost every indicator of development, Bangladesh is a fast-track country. It's had extraordinary achievements in nutrition, in child survival, and in education. It's one of the world's most rapidly urbanizing countries, and usually urbanization is associated with improvements in human development indicators. And yet it's a country that's often associated with child labour. So we wanted to explore in slum areas, what is the relationship. And so this is just a little bit of background context to the report. So if you look at the national, there have been various national surveys of child labour. Now, bear in mind, if you do a national survey, you're not picking up, you're not necessarily attaching the right weighting to the parts of the country where child labour is most prevalent, like urban slums, the most deprived rural areas, and so on. So this is sort of spreading it out across a representative country sample, but it's not a representative child labour sample. So this in a nutshell is the story. So if you believe the national survey data, there are around 1.6 million child labourers in Bangladesh. That's about 2% of the 5 to 17 age group. And something like 3/4 of that 2% are in hazardous labour on the Bangladeshi definition. The definitions matter because the Bangladesh government has never signed up for the first of the ILO conventions and allows children to work up to 42 hours a week in what is called light work, which is very poorly defined. So bear in mind the 2% number reflects this definition. So that's the backdrop on child labour. So essentially, officially, this is not a national problem in the official data. On education, so Bangladesh, on the left-hand side, you've got the column for net primary school enrolment, which is 97%. But you can see attendance is much lower than 97%. Transition to secondary school is much lower again. Here too, definitions matter because compulsory education in Bangladesh is from the age of 5 to 10. The age at which compulsory education in Britain ran to the age of 10, the year rather, that the age ran to 10 in Britain was 1880. So compulsory education in Bangladesh is set at a level at 1880 for the UK. And if you just go to the next slide. And one of the things that's going on behind that slide is this is basic graph which shows you school dropout rates. And without going into detail, you can see there's a peak around grade 4. In other words, when kids are around the age of 8 or 9, if they entered school at the right time, most of them don't actually. They typically start 1 or 2 years late. And then there's a huge spike around between grade 6, 7, and then up to grade 8. So what this is capturing is that nationally, whatever the data tells you about enrolment, there are really big problems underneath that. So we wanted to explore in the survey, what was going on behind this national picture in these slum areas of Bangladesh, which Maria will talk to.
Indeed.
Okay. Thank you, Kevin. Maria.
Yeah. So because of all the reasons that Kevin mentioned, we decided to conduct the survey in Dhaka City Corporation. The survey was conducted between August 2015 and August 2016 in 8 different tanas that are administrative units of Dhaka and 23 slums. We listed 4,500 children and we interviewed 2,700 children and their parents. What we were expecting to find before conducting the survey and based on previous research was that 5% of the children in the slums would be working. This is research from Understanding Children Work published in 2011. What we found instead is around 15% of children are working. That is 3 times more what we expected. And another 16% of children are neither going to school nor working. So doing nothing, this so-called idle children. Child labor prevalence is very much related to age, with age and gender. So this is the picture for boys and girls. As you can see, boys usually start working when they are 10 to 11, and girls when they are 11 to 12. Child labor increases steadily from when children are 8 to when children are 14. When they are 8, 10% of children are working. When they are 14, 45% of children are working. So 1 in 2, basically. As Kevin suggested, these children are working far beyond the 42 hours limit that is set by the Bangladeshi legislation. On average, and this is an average really, they are working 64 hours a week. So we are talking about 6 to 7 days a week, 11 to 12 hours a day, and of course these children are exhausted, and it's very difficult for them to combine education and working. Of the 15% of children that are working, only 1% manage to go to school. And just because they work 4 or 5 hours a day, not 11. To put that into perspective, you can see that if a child is working on average 64 hours a week in Bangladesh, in the European Union and the United Kingdom, an adult is working a maximum hour by law of 48 hours a week. Children are mainly engaged in the garment sector, and this is especially the case for young girls. We found that 62% of girls are working in the garments sector, around 13% of boys. Why are they working? Well, Kevin said it clearly, mainly because of poverty. This is the case for 54% of boys and 64% of girls. So this is what they told us. Poverty is the main reason, so the hardship that their households are facing. It's not the only reason. Many boys told us that they're actually not interested in school. What we realized is that the schools in slums are not able to keep children in school, so their quality is quite poor. Girls are working to pay family debt, to pay medical bills, or because tuition fees are too expensive. So based on these preliminary results, we then formulated policy recommendations, and Kevin will be talking about them.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Indeed, Maria, can we get to Mushtaq on the line again? Mushtaq, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, good. We've heard the presentation by Maria and Kevin. I just wondered whether you could add something from the Bangladesh perspective, particularly about how much this is due to a structural weakness in the Bangladeshi education system, or whether it's more a function of economic forces or a combination of the two.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you, and a very good afternoon to everybody. We at BRAC and the BRAC University are very happy to be at least a part of this study, and I congratulate both Kevin and Maria for doing this very interesting study, of course. As Maria has been saying, I think the situation is quite bad, but I don't think it is only the education system which should be blamed for that. There are many other reasons. I mean, some of these have been already mentioned, such as poverty, for example. There is a high opportunity cost there in the urban areas, and also the unscrupulous employers. They choose children because they're cheap, they are easily exploitable, they don't protest any abuse, for example, and many of these kids actually live on the streets, which means that they don't have any guardians and so on and so forth. So there are many reasons, of course, beyond the educational system, but the educational system has to be blamed to a large extent. There are many weaknesses in the system which can actually, I mean, if those are corrected, then it can take care of that. So the weaknesses that I can identify in the education system are threefold. One is the question of access. Second is the question of those system-related issues. And third is the question of quality. So in terms of access, there is a shortage of schools in the urban areas. If you look at the recent history of establishment of schools, most of the schools were set up in the rural areas. So there is a shortage of schools in the urban areas, particularly in the slums. So that's one reason, the shortage of schools. But also, since most of the schools are not in the slums, so the children have to go to a school which can be a little away. And given the traffic in Dhaka, many of the parents feel very unsafe to send their children to those areas. In terms of the system-related things, of course, one of the issues that we find always is the rigid timing. The schools, the government schools particularly, sit at a fixed hours, but these kids have to work. I mean, whether they like it or not. So if the school hours is little flexible, then many of the children can probably go to school. There are also issues related to the status of these children who come from the slums. And many of these children are considered by the school or by their peers as kind of socially untouchable. So many of these children, even if they are admitted, they don't feel like very welcome in the school. Now, with respect to the quality-related things, for example, the corporal punishment is still there in our school systems. Also, that the education that is given in the primary schools, for example, is not very exciting. There is hardly any fun there, and the whole thing is very uninteresting for children. And also, the parents also doubt whether by sending them to the schools, whether they will be learning anything. And recently, we have done a study under a initiative called the Bangladesh Education Watch, in which we looked at the literacy, which is part of the SDG 4. And we found that literacy is not achieved until someone completes grade 5 and 6 education. So they have to wait for 5 and 6 years in order to just to get the functional literacy. So I mean, this also speaks about the quality of education in our schools. But I feel that it is possible to bring a large number of them back to school if you can address some of these constraints that I was talking about. But the whole thing about child labor in the slums of Dhaka, for example, are part of the bigger urban challenges. And we know that, as has been said earlier, that Dhaka is growing very fast, but we are not at all prepared for that. So that's so as I said, that this is part of a bigger urban challenge, urban problem. So it's possible to bring many of the children back to school if we can also think of doing some small changes in the way the education system works. So one of the things is if we can introduce flexible school hours, and the BRAC has been doing non-formal primary education for the last 30 years. And what we have seen is that if we can be a little flexible on the school hours, then many of these children can actually come to school. Also, in many of the countries, this CCT, the conditional cash transfer, has really worked. So that's another way that one can think of how to address this. And more important, I think, once they are in school, there has to be empathy. There is also a need for counseling for the kids to be remaining in the schools. In terms of the RMG sector, the ready-made garments, there has been a huge improvement also in the way the RMGs actually employ child labor. This is mainly due to the pressure from the buyers in Europe and America. So not many factories actually want to employ children. So enforcement of those codes would also be helpful to really sort of get rid of this curse.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. We'll come back to you. Please stay on the line. We'll come back to you a bit later when we open it up to questions. And feel free to add your contribution in the debate, please. One of the things you learn when you're actually chairing something with Kevin on the panel is always butting in. So before you never shut him up really. And so before I ask Phil to contribute, Kevin would quite like to say something additional, which he clearly forgot to say when he was opening things up. Phil, I do apologise, but you know the score as well as I do.
Just to correct you on this, you were supposed to go back to me before going on to Mushtaq. Anyway, Larry, what I would just to really to set the scene a bit for Phil, I just wanted to say what some of the major policy recommendations in the report are, and I think as Mushtaq says, there's a supply and demand side of this problem, and part of it is about fixing the education system. Bangladesh heavily underinvests in quality primary education, and in particular the level of public provision in slum areas is appallingly low. So it's either NGOs like BRAC or private providers who price the poorest kids out of the market. There's a broader point. If you look at the history of the eradication of child labour across the world, compulsory education has always played a significant role. It played a big role in the UK, and I think it could play a very significant role in Bangladesh. But you have to set the compulsory education legislation at a credible level. Like 10 is not a credible level. So raising it to 14 is one of the recommendations that we make. The case for targeted conditional cash transfers, I think, is overwhelming because these are areas that are very easy to target. They're very defined geographic areas. I should say that Mushtaq also made a really important point about street children, who we don't include in the survey, and if we did, the numbers would be far worse. The two other areas that I think are really important is that this is at the interface between education policy and labour market policy and regulation. There is essentially no effective attempt at the regulation of labour markets in Bangladesh to keep child labour out of the economy. And that's actually because the economic policy is in part designed to facilitate the exploitation of child labour. There are something like, I think, 20 cases a year of employers who actually get prosecuted under this legislation. And given the scale of the challenge, I think that tells you everything you need to know about how serious that commitment is. The other thing to say is that the garments industry and the retail brands do a very good job of telling their consumers that through voluntary codes, they are keeping or screening child labour out of their value chains. And I think what the evidence from this report shows is that is a totally implausible argument. There are something like 7,000 export-oriented factories in Dhaka, in Bangladesh, most of them in Dhaka. A very sizable number of them are indirect exporters, that is to say they're suppliers of the really big guys who are exporting to Gap. And they in turn are often supplied by subcontractors. Now the voluntary codes never go below the first tier. And even the ones that do the first tier, even when they find non-compliance, there's never, we didn't find a single case actually of prosecution. You know, suppliers get invited to improve their practices. They then don't improve them in the reporting systems that go back to the retail chains, but the market continues. So, you know, in the same way that I think the Bangladeshi government is facilitating the exploitation of child labour, exactly the same is true of the retailers who are benefiting from it and linking them to us. I suspect each of us in this room may well be wearing a garment that was part produced by some of the kids we interviewed in the survey.
Okay, smashing. So, I mean, you said earlier, Kevin, that Bangladesh was actually a relatively good record on, you know, child poverty and on education and so on. So, Phil, you know, can you broaden it out? Maybe there's all sorts of ILOs called ILO conventions. There's conventions on the rights of the child, and governments have their own national codes. I mean, is Bangladesh typical? Better than the average, worse than the average? You know, how does it put this in some sort of international context for us, if you can?
Okay, I think it's fair to say that child labour is probably in the great majority of global supply chains. You know, it's certainly in our wardrobes with the clothes that we wear, and that's not just in the sewing, but it's in right from the picking of the cotton to the weaving of the yarn through to the making of the clothes. It's in our kitchen cupboards with hazelnuts and all of the many other types of commodities, including our chocolate. It's even in our cars, in the mica, in the metallic paint of the cars. You know, there's children down those mica mines in India. So it's really, it's not that it's in every, you know, it's not that it's a massive part of the supply chain, but it is a significant part of the supply chain, and it's fairly ubiquitous, I think is a reasonable set of conclusions. I mean, and it's also the case that there is tremendous opportunity, and people will take that, unscrupulous people, as Mustafa was saying, will take that opportunity to make super profits out of children and out of slavery. An example of that at the moment is, of course, large numbers of Syrian refugees moving into Turkey. What happens? The Turkish apparel factories take large numbers of children, extraordinary numbers of children, into those factories, paying them less than half the minimum wage, along with a lot of those Syrian women. And the reality is that there's really no effort on the part of the global brands, apart from 3 or 4, according to our surveys. Perhaps 3 or 4 of the global brands that are supplying directly into Western Europe with these clothes have really made any what you could call a significant effort. And I'm not talking about best practice; I'm talking about better practice. So that's the reality of it. I think, you know, as other people have said, it's why does it happen? It's because there's supply, because there's highly vulnerable people, you know, kids that desperately need to get out to work, parents who are low educated themselves, as the report points out, low educated parents, poor wages. It's those children that get put into work early, thus that vicious cycle continues. Second is the demand that is there, and there's definitely a demand for that cheap and pliant labour, again, as others have highlighted. It's great to hear that, you know, there is a significant decline in the demand in Bangladesh for child labour, and I think that is coming from the fact that many of the brands now realise that they can get away with quite a lot, but the child labour issue is one that gets on the front pages of The Guardian and some of your competitors, who will not be named. On a regular basis, and it's that pressure that has been making quite a lot of the difference there. But it's also to do with the weak rule of law and the sense of impunity of the factory owners as well as of the brands. And in that sense, you've got to say, you know, the fact is that in the Bangladeshi parliament, 24 of the parliamentarians are factory owners, and many, many more have direct relationships with the factories themselves. So it gives you a sense that they don't necessarily feel a tremendous heat on them from the national politic. But equally, the global brands are getting away with it far too much in terms of the impunity. I mean, globalization has done many things, but one of it is it's made supply chains extraordinarily long, and those extraordinarily long supply chains means you can hide one hell of a lot. And so that's another reason why these things are so prevalent. A few companies are making a real effort. You know, there's people like Adidas, Gap, H&M, even Primark. But I'd just highlight as well, if you're wearing a luxury brand, please don't think that there isn't modern slavery and child labour in there, because to be frank with you, you know, in some of our stuff, Prada, Kering comes out of some of the worst in terms of their actual policies and practice, at least. So that's another element to it. As Kevin said, one of the fundamental things that the companies have to do is move from an entirely discredited audit and compliance statement system. They go and they say, send a message, and they say, in 6 weeks, we're coming to inspect the factory, and we'll be looking for children and people paid below the minimum wage. Well, it really lives in fear, of course, of that day when, of course, all the children get removed and the pack bill come and they don't find anything. And so, you know, the fact is that there's a huge amount of auditing going on in Turkey. The great majority of those that we surveyed of the brands came back to us and hand on heart said, we have found no refugees in our supply chain. And Panorama turns up as we turned up. We turned up a day after the coup, so it wasn't the best moment to be bombing around factories looking for child. We found them on the first day, large numbers of children in the factory. The brands couldn't possibly find them; it was too hard, you know. But it's self-evident that this system is festooned with falsehoods, you know, because the system is set up to do that. But moving now to, you know, what is effectively due diligence, and some of the companies are moving to that, where they really do identify where the high risks are in their supply chain. They do deep dive research into those areas, and then they start to work out how they can really send communicate a message systemically through the supply chain to say we will not tolerate this, and we are looking at, and we will be doing unannounced audits and all the rest of it. So it's perfectly doable. It's not rocket science. The last thing I'd say is that, as others have said, you know, the fact is that we can't wait for the Bangladeshi government, unfortunately, to do the right thing. You know, the fact that it's got so many parliamentarians that are factory owners and others with interests. So other governments can make much more of it. And I think there's lessons to be learned here from what's happening on modern slavery. You know, in modern slavery, we've got, for instance, Theresa May's Modern Slavery Act, which is not the most extraordinary radical piece, but it does move from this appalling idea that governments should be so timid as to ask for a little voluntary action by the brands to actually say, no, it's mandatory transparency from now on. You've got to produce a compliance statement if you've got a turnover of more than 36 million and you want to play in the British market. We could be doing more of that, and that has extraterritorial reach. It's not if you're a British company, it's if you're any company that wants to play in the British market. So that has major territorial reach. Japanese companies are coming to us going, well, hang on, are we about to be prosecuted if we carry on working in having a market in the UK? The other one is really governments demanding mandatory due diligence, and the Obama government has done this with the Trade Enforcement, Trade Facilitation Act. It effectively demands that companies that have got supplies from regions and products that are high risk in terms of modern slavery, and this could easily apply to child labour, they have to, the burden of evidence is on them. They have to prove that stuff has not been produced under conditions of slavery, and if they can't prove it, those goods can be impounded at port. So there's a big incentive to demonstrate that due diligence. Finally, governments have to, if they've signed these bloody protocols, the governments should ensure at least that when they're purchasing services and products, that the companies have demonstrated that they are demonstrating that due diligence and transparency. And if they're not, they shouldn't have a slice of the government's market. This is a massive market that the government has in the US, in Europe. And so again, that incentive the creation of that incentive could be hugely important.
So why are governments so timid then when it comes to enforcing these protocols which they've actually signed up to? I mean, I can imagine, for example, that Donald Trump might be a bit keener on enforcing some of these protocols, if not for perhaps the right reasons. But you know, it's a way of protecting the American market, isn't it?
No, it is, and there is always that issue of protection. But I think there are ways of going about it which is clearly not about protection. It's about the protection. It's not about protectionism. It's about the protection of children. And I think in that sense, why have governments not done it? It's effectively because there's an enormous timidity towards asking anything of companies at the moment. There is an extraordinary timidity of asking the most basic stuff, even in terms of UK law, let alone elsewhere. It's all to do with voluntarism, and governments have abandoned that responsibility, in my opinion, to combine, to create a smart mix of regulation with demands for voluntary action.
Okay. So does this have to come from consumers then? Does the real pressure have to come from consumers through onto governments and then onto them enforcing the protocols, or if anybody can join in?
I mean, just to take the transparency, if North America and Canada, US, Mexico, and European Union all said there will be we all demand mandatory transparency. Yeah. So everybody's got to make a statement as to whether they're eliminating. We're not asking, you don't have to eliminate, you just have to make a statement as to whether you are eliminating. That at least exposes that. That allows investors to start to say, well, hang on, what level of risk is this company running? Yeah. And therefore I'll price my capital and their access to capital accordingly. It allows talent, who the companies are desperate to attract, to say which company is more likely to reflect the values that I want to live through my short life on this planet. And then it also allows customers to eventually to say which of the companies that are at least making some effort.
Okay, right, I'm going to open it up to questions in a minute. Kevin, maybe you could just kick things off. I mean, let's ask you this question. What would you do if you had the power concretely to end? And I'd like Mushtaq to answer this question too from the Bangladeshi point of view, but what concretely, I mean, Phil's given us a few ideas. What would you do if you had the opportunity?
Well, I think the answer is that, the point you're making is a really important one, because if you look at the history of the way that child labour has been taken up in the north, in the past there have been occasions, if you go back to the 80s, when it was partly driven by trade unions in the north, some of whom did see it as a straight protectionist thing, and it was linked to other things which were overtly protectionist. And that in itself engendered a sort of very populist backlash. So, if you talk about child labour in India, there's an immediate assumption that you're basically working for, either trade union in the north or whatever. So, and there is a sense in which if you just try and regulate it out of the economy to say, we're going to prohibit child labour from next year, for those kids, for whom this is a survival thing, that they're not working for fun, it's not a paper round here. So if you just do it by regulation, you can actually compound the underlying poverty that's causing the problem. So I think you need a sequencing of things, which is, first of all, you need the economic measures and the social support programs and the cash transfer programs that make it possible for parents and kids to make the choice. That I choose not to send my kid to school, and we're not going to suffer malnutrition as a result. You then need the education system that makes education a choice. That you need a school within a mile, not 5 miles away, and it needs to have a teacher, and it needs to deliver learning. And then you really need to enforce the regulatory stuff. And Phil's right. I think the truth is that at the moment, the brand retailers here are trying to do something which enhances their reputation in the eyes of their consumers, not do something that solves the underlying problem through serious intervention. And, it shouldn't be voluntary. I mean, this is criminal. You should go down for this stuff in Bangladesh and internationally. That's the...
Okay. Mushtaq, can I bring you in here from the perspective of Bangladesh? What concretely would make a difference to this issue that's been highlighted by this report in your country?
One of the findings that I see here is that 16.2% of the children are neither studying nor working in the study population. which means that at least 16% of the children of the type of children who have been covered by this study could easily be brought to schools if certain sort of measures are taken. But beyond that, those who are already working, a number of things can be done, and Kevin has alluded to many of these, I think. It's both a demand side and also the supply side thing that need to be done. I mean, the experience that we have in Bragg, for example, we mostly work in the rural areas, but we have been working also in the urban areas, in the slums for the last many years. And the experience is that it is possible to bring children to school if you are a little flexible the way that we run an education system. And one is the flexible flexi hour. The second is the empathy of the teacher, and how the whole pedagogy and those kind of things which sort of make a learning a fun. So if those kind of things are done, it is possible to really change the situation. And also, I mean, we should also think of the experience from Mexico, for example, with respect to conditional cash transfer kind of things. So we can also think of those incentives for the parents to send their children who are now in factories and other places, to send them to schools.
Okay, smashing. Right. Now I'm going to open things up to questions, and what I'm going to do is take them in batches of 3 if possible. So can I ask you to do 2 things for me, which would be helpful? One, tell me who you are, and secondly, to keep your questions nice and short if you can, and then we'll get more people in. So I can see a gentleman there, and I can see a lady there, and I can see a gentleman here, and I will move across the room. So perhaps you just let us know who you are, sir, and then we'll ask your question.